Dr. Pat Markey and Dr. Chris Ferguson. Welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you on the show. You two have written a book with a very provocative title. Let me just show it up for our viewers on YouTube. Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. That just sounds so wrong, though. How can violent video games not be bad for you? So before you answer that question, how did the two of you come to write this book?
Well, we've both been doing research in the area for about a decade now.
Wow.
And so we've known each other through our interactions really in the research community as active researchers. And in doing all of the research we've done, we've ran across different people and politicians and media outlets who've been concerned about video games and very often misunderstand what the research suggests and what it shows. And so I think for Chris and I, this was kind of one of our ways to try to discuss with the general public what scholars have been finding in the world of video games. And for the most part, like your reaction, most people are surprised at what the research actually shows.
Yeah.
In contrast to the sensationalism that we hear in the media.
Yeah, well, going through your book, I certainly got converted, I would say, quite a bit. I have some history, if I had been an experimentalist rather than a clinician, this is an area I would have loved to have gotten involved in and to have done research on too, because it's really one of the pivotal issues of our time, I think, and connected to other pivotal issues that are related to technology and how it's all impacting our lives and what the implications of it all are. And I actually have some history with it in terms of I had another hat in addition to being a psychology professor of being a market researcher. And I got involved in market research because I had originally planned to be an electrical engineer. And then as things happened, I became a clinical psychologist instead. And then in the early 80s, personal computers broke on the scene. And I went, oh, darn, I should have become an engineer. This is really exciting stuff. And so as I was searching for, well, how could I get involved? I got involved through the vehicle of becoming a market researcher. And so I did research for some of the early video game companies like Atari and Electronic Arts and so on. So maybe I'll weave in more of those experiences as we go along. So do I understand you guys to be saying that playing violent video games is not psychologically or socially harmful?
I think basically, I mean, if you're like painting with broad strokes, I guess essentially yes, or at least the evidence for there being sort of harmful effects, things that actually affecting the psychological well-being of minors, isn't really clear. And I think really the way of thinking of it is really, it's not so much that media doesn't really have an effect on us. It's more that it's really kind of hard to pin down one type of media having the same effect on everyone. So it's possible that some people might play a violent video game and maybe feel a little bit angrier. But as I kind of mentioned in the book, I feel that way after watching Full House. I mean, so that because I don't like the show. The way that people sort of respond to media is very different from one person to another one. And I think that kind of the way that the message has come out kind of badly to the public is this idea that you can be exposed to something that's sort of naughty, objectionable. There's objectionable media, and that everybody who views it is going to do that thing, and whatever that thing may be. So I think people oftentimes mix up their, moral repugnance to certain types of media. And there certainly are games and books and other kinds of media that have objectionable content. But people are kind of mixing up that kind of moral, like, oh, this is icky, with therefore it must somehow be harmful, particularly to kids or youth or something of that sort. So right now, I mean, in terms of most things, the evidence isn't really very clear that there are these relationships between cause and effect, between viewing these games and behaving in a way that would be a public health level of sort of violent or aggressive behavior in real life.
Okay, so you seem to be saying that there might and relatively rare cases be some identifiable problems associated with violent video games, but that in general, that doesn't seem to be the case?
Oh, only in the sense that there are, identifiable problems for some people reading the Bible or reading Catcher in the Rye or watching a Shakespearean play. It's really just kind of difficult to sort of pin down, this sort of medium is going to have this kind of effect on other individuals. We really don't see the evidence that violent video games are any worse than nonviolent video games or a nonviolent book or a violent book or something of that sort.
And when we're talking about video games too, it's really important to remember that there tends to be a couple areas that people are most concerned about, and that ranges from violent media and aggression or violence in the real world, and as well as video game addiction. Those are the two big topics that parents, the media, politicians, and researchers are really the most concerned about. And it's important to remember that, just because one may have an effect in one doesn't mean it has an effect in the other. But as Chris said, what the research suggests is actually for violence, we actually tend to find the opposite might be happening, that it actually might be responsible for decreases in real violence. And for addiction, we really don't find there to be any addictive quality to video games any more so than any other activity might be addictive that a person might overdo, like exercise or anything along those lines. But there's nothing special about video games in themselves that make them particularly more addictive, like heroin or something along those lines that we all recognize.
Well, maybe we'll come back to those two areas, the violence and the addiction. I probably should ask, and I don't know if it's totally relevant, but are you guys parents? Do you have kids?
We do.
You are?
Yeah, we do. Not together, but we do.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So am I correct that you see violent video games as feeding an evolutionary driven hunger by our brains for adventure and excitement? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I mean, I think there's sort of a whole parallel question about, why are we, not just now, but historically, why have we as a species always been so interested in violent media, whether you're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh through, violent video games, today. There's always been this kind of, allure to that sort of material. And I think it's an interesting question. I mean, and I do think that probably says something about, who we are as a species. And as you say, there's probably some evolutionary drive to be interested in this sort of stuff. And it tends to be males more than females, which also kind of fits with some evolutionary context. Although there's plenty of women who like action movies and violent video games, of course, but there still tends to be a bit of a gender divide. And it kind of suggests, and of course, with anything with evolutionary, it's going to be a little bit speculative, of course, but, suggests that there's some sort of, we're driven to be interested in this, but it's kind of nice to be able to experience it in a safe space. We really don't want to go to war, most of us at least, and experience violence firsthand. We don't want to go into a criminal environment where we're going to get assaulted. But nonetheless, it's part of our wiring. And so being able to experience through a video game or sports or through a book or something of that sort seems to be something that is motivational for a lot of people, at least. Not everybody, but a lot of people.
Yeah. I have one of my guilty pleasures is I love reading Scandinavian noir novels, and, really, and lots of sort of crime novels and suspense novels and so on, and some of those kinds of movies as well. So I feel a little bit vindicated by what you're saying.
And I think also the other reason why people are attracted to video games, and again, any media, is it fulfills various needs of ourselves. So like, we might have the need to feel agentic. And so in this video game world, we can feel high levels of agency. We might feel a need to be connected to other people. And if we're playing video games online, we can actually talk to other people.
Yeah.
So it might actually satisfy virtually some of our basic needs that we have for various reasons.
Now, most people would have an initial reaction to your thesis. Why the war on violent video games is wrong, of a sort of moral conviction. And indeed, you spend quite a bit of time talking about what you call moral panic. So tell us a bit about moral panic. What is moral panic? Maybe there's some historical examples that come to mind.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think that, you know, sort of the essence of moral panic is, you know, you kind of did it perfect. Then that, and, you know, your initial reaction was, how can this be? I was, you know,
Right.
and I think that's what happens with a moral panic. I mean, that's really what the theory says, is that with a moral panic, you have a certain group in society who are the sort of, you know, quote unquote, the more powerful members of society, which tend to be older adults, who vote, you know, who have more financial resources, who buy newspapers or subscriptions to, you know, online subscriptions to newspapers, which young people don't generally do for the most part. And so you have this audience, and this audience kind of makes up its mind initially. So right off the bat, society is represented by usually older adults, decides violent video games are bad. Okay, so the decision's made at that point. Right? It's I saw this clip on Fox News, and it made me feel icky. Therefore, this thing is going to hurt kids. So we need politicians to do something about this, and we need researchers to point out just how bad this media is. And therefore, all the pressure or all the incentives in society, at least initially, fall on politicians, news media, and scholars to support the panic. You know, so newspapers are going to get more subscriptions. You know, if you have a headline that says violent video games are damaging the brains of kids, that's a lot better than a headline that says video games probably don't do anything. They're fun. You know, you're going to get a lot more paid clicks or, you know, subscriptions. You know, same thing with politicians. You know,
but right on the face of it, I mean,
Yeah.
thinking of as a hypothetical parent rather than myself,
Yeah.
just on the face of it, hey, exploding heads, blood being splashed all over the screen, as a parent who maybe doesn't play video games at all, just on the face of it, that can't be good.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that there are certainly various reasons why we might not have our children play violent video games. For example, my children don't play violent video games.
Oh, interesting.
But it's important to remember they don't play violent video games not because I'm scared they're going to go out and commit homicides or that they're going to become addicted to it. They don't play violent video games for the same reason I don't let them watch, you know, the news. It's simply because at their young age, I'm trying to kind of protect them from what might be scary and so forth to prevent.
There you go. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important that just because we're saying violent video games are not causing school shootings, that they're not causing raises in homicides, that they're not addictive, we're not saying that sure, let, you know, your 3-year-old play Grand Theft Auto in your lap. That's not at all what we're saying.
Okay.
And so there's lots of reasons why kids or adults might actually limit their intake of violent media. Me personally, I hate violent or scary films. I get scared like a little baby. And so I purposely don't watch them. But again, it's not because I'm scared they're going to change me. I'm going to become addicted or I'm going to become homicidal. It's simply because they give me nightmares. So I don't want to see them.
Yeah.
So this is not as if, you know, all our children should play violent video games to make the world better. That's not at all what our argument is. It's simply that the moral panic, which what Chris is talking about, tends to focus on things like school shootings, video game addiction. And those are the things why we have Supreme Court cases. Those are the reasons why, you know, there are panels in Washington to discuss violent media. It's not because, you know, we're worried about watching our children potentially have nightmares. And so that's the moral panic that we're talking about.
Okay, I like some of the examples that you gave in the book of, you said, first of all, that moral panic tends to be over protecting the kids, that there are a lot of examples of that out of our desire to protect our kids. And also to technological changes can trigger moral panics. And you gave examples of the printing press, comic books, rock and roll music.
Yeah.
And I thought those are great examples where, as you say, Chris, the older folks tend to freak out about our kids, you know, what's going to happen to our kids here. So you've referred a couple of times to school shootings, and that is a huge topic. And Columbine is one of the examples that you talk about in the book. And so were people concerned about violent video games in the case of the Columbine shooters? Were they, in fact, kids who were immersed in those?
Yeah, so Columbine's an interesting case because pre-Columbine year, we see interest in violence in video games was actually pretty low, that there wasn't a lot of what we would call the moral panic about video games. But post-Columbine, there's this explosion in research that suddenly happens right after that horrific event. And the reason why Columbine gets linked to video games is because the two killers in the Columbine did play Doom, the video game Doom, that they certainly did. There's no doubt about that. But of course, so did millions of other people. It's an immensely popular game that, so it was played all over the place. There's a lot of myths around it. For example, there's a myth that they created levels of their high school in Doom and practiced and so forth. And when their computers are examined, there's no such levels that can be found. So there's a lot of myths that build on that are also there. But certainly they played it. And that's what got people worried for the same reasons you said, that at the time, this video game Doom looked scary. You're running around in a first-person shooter, which was new to a lot of people. And so it had that scary look. And combine that with the horrific event, they become linked with each other. Yeah. And then so forever then, from that point on, whenever there's a school shooting perpetrated by a male youth, the media, politicians, and so forth always try to see if they can link video games to it in some way. And I'm sure, as Chris will tell you, very often they're wrong. And
yeah, sometimes don't let the truth get in the way of a good story. But and probably the classic example of that is actually. I mean, it's really kind of two. There's the 2007 Virginia Tech shooting that, people talked a lot about video games for quite a while. But in the official investigation report, it turned out the only game they could find that he played was Sonic the Hedgehog, which is not, by most people's standards, a, quote unquote, violent video game. And then more recently, the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting, where, it's committed by a 20-year-old male. And the official investigation report didn't come out for about 11 months until, after the shooting. And so there's really a lot of speculation, a lot of claims in the news media, quoting anonymous sources saying that he had racked up thousands of hours online playing games like Call of Duty and made thousands upon thousands of headshots and things like this. And it made it sound like these were leaks from the investigation that were kind of semi-official. But then when the investigation report came out, they found that, like most guys, he probably played some violent and some non-violent games, but he mostly played Dance Dance Revolution, which is really a very innocuous, it's a dancing game, essentially. Yeah. Really quite obsessed with that game, and he really wasn't playing a lot of violent video games. So I've always kind of been curious who these anonymous leaks were, because they made it sound like they were police officers close to the official investigation, but apparently they weren't. Because the investigation report, really kind of exonerated this issue of violent video games. And they did a document dump about a month later where they kind of released like all the individual reports done by the individual police officers as they were interviewing people and all that. And even some of the police officers were saying, don't believe these, to the families of the victims, they were saying, don't believe these, what they call them, hoax theories, they call them, that are being reported in the news media. So it really wasn't a facet of the investigation into Sandy Hook, whether he was, incited by video games in some way or another. But you still sometimes hear people talk about, these people are all violent video game players, just like the Sandy Hook shooter. And well, I mean, the Sandy Hook shooter is not a great example if that's the thesis that you're trying to put together. If you believe that Dance Dance Revolution is the source of all evil, which maybe it is, that might be a better case study for that, but not for violent video.
Yeah.
And then even moving beyond the case studies that Chris is talking about, obviously it's important to look at overall trends, because we can always anyone can always find a case that fits a particular story, right? So we can fit Columbine with they played violent video games. We can fit this one shooting where they didn't. But what we've done in the book is we present research by us as well as research done by the Secret Service, where they actually profiled school shooters to see are there typical characteristics of school shooters. And, there's they tend to be males, they tend to be students, they tend to be depressed, kind of the things you might expect. But the one thing that actually doesn't come out is, and it doesn't matter which lab you look at, the findings are pretty much the same, is that school shooters, only about 13 to 20% of them had a lot of interest in violent video games. So we actually see a fairly low percentage. And what's even more shocking is if we compare that to the average high school student, shooters tend to be male adolescents. Research there suggests it's around 70%. So actually, video games are linked to school shootings, but it's almost linked in the opposite direction, is that school shooters actually tend to show less of an interest in violent video games than the average high school student. And that probably doesn't mean that video games are good, that playing violent games is preventing students from committing these horrific acts. It's probably just because playing violent video games for male adolescents today is a very normative activity, that it's a sign actually of psychological health or psychological adjustment. As parents, you and I might not be too thrilled that they're playing these violent video games, but all their friends are playing it. It's what they're talking about. It actually shows that they probably are making connections to other individuals. Whereas when a child doesn't play these games, or a teen doesn't play these games, it actually might be a sign that there's something amiss socially with them. We don't know for sure the reason why, but again, the statistics are there that you don't see that link with violent video games and school shootings, even across most school shootings.
Yeah. As a bit of an aside, this is the idea of this moral contagion that can kind of suffuse society, if you will, brings to mind psychedelics and a kind of huge moral panic, if you will, around psychedelics that's now beginning to soften because there's research that needs to be done in that area, and it's just starting to open up again, that there are some sanctioned research projects that find positive uses for psychedelics in certain therapeutic situations, and so so there's a big similarity here, I think.
Yeah, well, and related to your example is there's a study done where they examined children who either experimented they examined their personalities when they were young, then they examined them longitudinally across life, and they examined who had experimented with marijuana, who had abused marijuana, who had abstained from marijuana. And what they actually found were the most psychologically healthy individuals were those individuals who had experimented with marijuana. The abstainers tended to be very uptight and very, high-strung, whereas the abusers tended to have other issues. But the rub of the study is it was done in Berkeley in the 70s. And that in Berkeley in the 70s, smoking marijuana was a very normative activity. Yes. And so it just shows that when children do things that are normal, even if it might not be great for them, even if as parents we might not love it, very often doing normative activities is a sign of psychological health. And that might all be what video games are, is it's a normative activity today. And so engaging in it might just be a sign of psychological health for children and teens.
Yeah, and what that triggers for me is it may be part of a developmental phase that they move on. So a lot of the people that back when in my marijuana days, they don't smoke marijuana anymore. It was a thing then socially, and now at my age, it's not.
Although the average age of gamers is in the mid-30s, so I don't know if there's too many moving on.
That's true. In relation to games, it's been interesting to see that people really do stick with it, which some people would say, see, I told you it's addictive, right?
Well, it really is. It's really the new television. It's the entertainment. And so it's just harder for some people who didn't grow up with it to understand, I think, that it's really just another form of entertainment, like television, like movies and things of that sort.
One of the things that you pointed out that I really liked was you referred to a moral cyclone. And I think in both the psychedelic drug and the violent video games, that's very apparent, a moral cyclone that sweeps up even the scientists and the authorities and the authoritative associations, and so that everybody gets caught up in it. And as you point out, scientists and researchers are not invulnerable to that. And they may get caught up in it as well. And the research can become very politicized. And you've got a number of very nice graphs that are easy for people to understand, little step charts and so on. And I recall one that after the Columbine shooting, research on video games goes way up. It rises very steeply. But a lot of it was, as you point out, politicized, had flawed methodologies, etc. So I'll let you guys rhapsodize on that theme a little bit.
Well, I think it was interesting. Again, the Sandy Hook shooting was a great example of this because in some ways it was really kind of like looking at a moral panic unfold, in real time. And it happened again. News media obviously got caught up in it. Some scholars got caught up into it. But it was interesting to see, like, when people in politics would talk about research, and there were a few calls for research. I'm putting out in air quotes on purpose. And I think Senator Rockefeller was a great example of this. That right after the Sandy Hook shooting happened, he made a call for research, and I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember exactly how he said it, in fairness, but he said it something like, we need a study to show the damaging effects of video games so that we can legislate on this issue. And he came in for a lot of criticism, from me and from other people for that, because that's like really bad. That's a bad way of calling for science, because you're advertising what you want the science to say.
Yeah.
And scientists are human. We're not immune into this, so it's easier to get, grant funding, by, sort of at least implicitly promising a certain type of, video games may be damaging the brains of children. Could I have $1 million to study that? As opposed to, I don't think video games do anything. Could I have $1 million to study that? It's easier to get that funding by promising that you're somehow saving the world, if you will, or saving children through your research study. And same thing with headlines. We like getting headlines. We like being on podcasts and such. So, we're not immune to that sort of thing. So, finding ways to connect your research with the general public is exhilarating. I mean, I had the experience. I did one study. It had nothing to do with video games. It had to do with advertising effects on kids and eating choices. And there I actually found a relationship. I went in kind of skeptical, like I do with the video games, but I did actually find that, that kind of relationship. And I ended up getting emails from, advocates for that issue, praising me for saving children. And it was a rush in a way, like, wow, now I see it, like what it must feel like to be a scholar on the other side, to be saving the children. It was kind of fun in a way, so I can see where it's very easy to get caught up in that, feeling, it's an ego boost. These people are praising me, they're paying attention to me, they're going to give me grant funding, which is going to help my career. I'm going to get newspaper headlines, which is also quite wonderful for, my career, and so on and so forth. So again, we just have to remember that, it's not that this is happening in bad faith. It's just that scholars are human.
It's human, yeah.
We can get caught up in these kinds of moral panics or political, whatever's going on in society, whatever the societal narrative is, we can get caught up in it.
Yeah. In fact, you have a chapter titled Science Wars. And so tell us about that. Who are the protagonists in the science wars? Who's against who?
Well, in general, so there's certainly names on both sides, but it's interesting that there's definitely themes you see on both sides. That the people who tend to be more, if I just lack of a better word, the anti-video game researchers, they tend to be a little bit older. They actually do tend to be more established. They tend to be much more senior. They're well respected typically. They're former presidents of societies, that they are the big names. And a lot of that is because for years and years, really since Columbine, they've been publishing research studies suggesting video games have these horrific effects. And there's certainly issues that at the time, nobody really worried too much about their methodologies or anything. Everyone just kind of gave them a free pass. And now there's this younger group, and Chris and I are definitely the older one. We're not in part of this younger group, I think. It's a younger group of scholars that grew up surrounded by Nintendos, that grew up surrounded by Ataris, that understand video games. And they've really been challenging this established group. And it's been, it's definitely, Chris and I make fun, it's definitely like a nerd war. Like, it's not lightsabers or anything quite as exciting as that. But there's certainly a lot of hostility on both sides of the issue, that people's egos are wrapped up in it. People's careers have been wrapped up on it. Their identity of who they are is wrapped up on it. And it gets kind of ugly sometimes. It's a very interesting area because on both sides, the people are so dynamic and they're so interesting to watch argue with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talk about David and Goliath battles, and I guess the Goliaths are these well-established, big-name people, versus the younger ones who are coming up and hoping to get promoted.
I mean, I think you're certainly right, but I think there is in psychology as a field, as a whole, in the scientific area of psychology, we've kind of been going through this identity crisis of reevaluating ourselves as a science, of going back and looking at all of our methodologies. And certainly media research is a big area of this, but it's across the board in psychology that I think a lot of younger scholars have been trying to kind of clean things up and kind of get rid of, and again, I put myself in the older scholar category. Like, we messed up on a lot of research that we did when I was younger, when I was in graduate school. It wasn't as good as it should have been. And I think a lot of younger people have been kind of pointing that out to us now. And I think in the violent video game, that's certainly been happening even more loudly. It's just this general cleaning up of psychology as a science that's way overdue. And in the video game research, it's happening right now as we speak.
That's a very interesting perspective that we could have a long conversation about, looking at the broad view of what's going on in psychology around that. That really piques my interest. To quote from your book, you suggest, and I quote, inconsistencies between studies, dubious measures of aggression, the bizarre list of games researchers have called violent, and other methodological issues, close quote, are used to support conclusions that are utter rubbish, and utter rubbish is a quote. So you guys, as you look at the research that's being done, you see lots of methodological flaws.
Yeah, it's been pretty problematic, and I mean, first of all, there's the interesting question. I mean, we're kind of we're as guilty of this as everybody, but we always kind of use a shorthand of violent video games, but we really don't know what we even mean by that, because as we're kind of talking about, particularly with some of the older research going back to the 80s, people were worried about like Pac-Man, and asteroids and Zaxxon and games like that, games that now nobody thinks of as causing delinquency, but people kind of took it seriously back then, that these games were violent video games, just like people worry about Grand Theft Auto today. And at least according to the way the theories of media effects are supposed to work, Pac-Man should theoretically have as much influence on a teen as playing Grand Theft Auto does. I mean, I know that sounds like rubbish, but that's kind of the way that the field had developed, was to kind of think that way. It's simply rehearsing aggression over and over and over and over again is supposed to have these effects. Whether you're eating a ghost or beating up a police officer, it doesn't really make a difference necessarily. We get kind of wrapped up in the public, in the graphicness, but that's not really the central aspect of what is thought of as being harmful, according to these theories. But yeah, there have been, as Patrick said, I mean, the field really had gotten a pass on a lot of different issues. And we could probably go on, for an absurd amount of time talking about all the different problems that, are in a lot of the studies. Some of them would, have people in experiments play games that were so different on so many different levels. It was difficult to say that, it was the violence that was necessarily what, made people respond differently. There are some studies now that suggest that it's really more getting frustrated in a game that may increase mild aggression, not the violent content, which makes sense. I mean,
I can relate to
it may
that.
not be that different from the person that throws the cards across the room when they lose. The aggression measures are not very good. So there's one that's very commonly used. It's called the competitive reaction time test, or the noise blast test. So you give, it's like the Milgram study a little bit, that you give an opponent a burst of noise when they lose at a reaction time test. There's no real opponent; it's just all in the computer, of course. But there's scholars in Germany have found that there's like about, I think the count was now like 150 different ways that you could extract aggression from this one measure with one sample. So in other words, you as the researcher could pick and choose from among 150 different outcomes those that best fit your hypotheses and ignore those that don't fit your hypotheses, which is a real problem. I mean, it's kind of like going to the doctor and they give you 150 different thermometers, all calibrated differently, and just pick the ones that fit with their pre-existing beliefs about whether you were sick or not, And we wouldn't tolerate this from physicists or medical, hopefully, or medical researchers, but we're allowing this in psychological research. It's what's kind of called the methodological flexibility issue, this idea that researchers have an assortment of different outcomes that they can pick and choose between, and naturally, because there are biases towards significant results, they pick the results that are most significant. So having one assessment tool that has 150 different potential outcomes with no standardization and no rules about how you're supposed to pick aggression out of that is a very, very serious problem. And so, this particular researcher in Germany has documented that for some scholars, it's not just from scholar to scholar, you see people extracting aggression differently from this measure, but individual scholars from one paper to the next will use the same measure very differently in order to measure, aggression. And that's a real serious problem. It really kind of looks like, people are kind of trying to think of the polite way of putting it, massaging the data, perhaps, in order to fit a pre-existing belief. Now, they may be doing that unconsciously. It may be in good, but it's still bad.
And even beyond the massaging the data issues, which is a massive issue, as Chris pointed out, it's the generalizing of results we find in labs to horrific acts of violence. So, other measurements that researchers use are like, how much hot sauce do people give after playing a violent video game to people that don't like spicy food? Or they'll give them a list of words with letters missing, and they'll see what words they make out of it. And, do they make the word kill out of it? That's a sign of aggression. Or if they're given some kind of story and they say, how are you going to respond to this, incident? And they write, oh, I'm going to be really mad at this. That's a sign of aggression. And they take these kind of mundane measures of aggression, and they'll use those to suggest that gives insight into like school shootings and things of that sort. And so there tends to be a real disconnect between what we can do in the laboratory to examine real violent behavior and what we're actually really concerned about in the real world, real violent behavior. Yeah. And so even when researchers aren't kind of fudging with their data a little bit, there's problems with generalizing results. And this is certainly where, as I said, I was guilty of this too. When some of our first research we did in our lab was using some of these measurements in which, they're just proxy measurements for horrific acts of violence. Yeah. And so that's become a major issue in video game research as well.
Yeah. And you point out that even major professional associations get caught up in these science wars, if you will. And you talk about the American Psychological Association, which somehow was moved to develop a policy that was pretty much anti-video game. Is that right?
Yeah, they've had two policies, and they've actually had policies on media violence dating back to the 1990s, kind of looking at television and movie violence and such. I think that one's been retired at this point. But they had a policy in 2005, and then one in 2015 that had come out. The one in 2015 was perhaps a bit milder, but generally speaking, we're kind of anti-video game. As you were saying, and those policies, I think the one in 2005 kind of came out with relatively little opposition, because it was right in the middle of that post-Columbine. Everybody was worried about video games. There was kind of this unanimity among the scholars still at that particular point in time. So, I think that, groups like the APA, which I'm a member of, by the way, so just to throw that out there, but I think these groups are guilds, right? So people like myself, and I don't know if you've ever been a member, but people like us, yeah. So we pay because we think this organization is going to help us in some way or another, right? It's like $200 or $300 a year that we pay, and the idea is that they're going to make our lives easier, through licensing laws, through promoting the profession, through helping us get grants, or whatever that may be. It's going to make psychology look important, which is going to help us, whether we're researchers or clinicians. And so they function like guilds. They're not like objective arbiters of truth. They take positions they think are going to help their members or themselves in some cases. And so now, particularly with the 2015 policy statement, there was when the task force got announced, which was actually right after Sandy Hook, so late 2012, early 2013, there was a lot of concern that the task force looked stacked. Basically, that it was comprised of individuals who had already taken very public anti-video game positions. Only one of them had actually done research in the area, which was good in a way, but nonetheless, other people had taken very public views on the issue. So it looked like who knows what happened, and we don't have an inside view, but it looked like it was in bad faith. So, as a result, something like, I forget what the final tally was, something like 230 scholars wrote an open letter to the APA, just try, basically saying, maybe you shouldn't be releasing these policy statements, because it's really kind of this ambiguous research, and it's really difficult to say that there's a definitive answer. Unfortunately, the APA ignored that letter and released a policy statement anyway. So, and then there was a pretty considerable negative reaction to the APA's 2015, policy statement. The newspaper coverage of it wasn't very positive for the most part, and a lot of scholars have been critical of it again for making these kind of declarative statements when in fact the research is at least ambiguous, and doesn't really allow for us to make these, unequivocal statements about effects on aggression. The one thing that was good about the 2015 statement, perhaps, is they did say that it wasn't really possible to link video games to violent crime. But they did still try to say that there was this link with milder forms of aggression, even though the research literature is controversial and inconsistent. The policy statement really ignored most of the methodological controversies that have emerged in the field over the last few years. So there have been a lot of reviews now are coming out that have been quite critical of these guilds and the positions that they've taken on some of these issues.
Okay, one thing that caught my interest is you cite research by Dr. Dimitri Williams and Dr. Marko Skoric, who found that even long-term and repetitive exposure to violent video games did not increase aggression. Mm-hmm. And you go on to say that they got a lot of career-threatening flack for this, and it made me wonder if you guys have received flack for your position on violent video games.
Yeah.
Yeah. In what form?
Well, I mean, I'll be a little bit careful in terms of there may be some confidentiality issues around one of these issues. But I'll say I got an ethics complaint at one point that was dismissed. I won't say by who. I won't go into, but it had to do with video games and sort of coverage of this issue.
Interesting.
And it was a weird experience in that it wasn't like an ethics complaint over sleeping with your patients or or something that we would think of as being like a real issue. It really was over what was going on in the field of video game research. Now that got dismissed, but it does show you the level, I think, of Patrick was talking about some of the animosity that occurs in scholars in the field, and I think that gives you a sense of how heightened some of the emotions are among people in this field.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, I definitely when I go to meetings, sometimes it's not the most warm welcome, depending on the group I'm sitting with.
You're such nice guys.
We are. But no, it's both sides have very set beliefs. And I think both sides actually truly believe what they're saying, right? I don't think there's one side that's we're going to trick the other side or something like that. I think both sides. So I think you have that as well, that you have these egos, as I talked about. You also have, I think, both sides really believing that they have the truth. Mm-hmm. Which makes it hard, I think, for anyone to give in or to listen. And very often people who come in the middle, who want to be kind of in the middle, they quickly get pulled one way or the other in this kind of area. That it's a very interesting area to be in. Yeah,
I'll say. Well, let's talk a bit about addiction. You've got a whole chapter on addiction, and that certainly is a major concern that people have. I've got 4 kids. They're all adults now. And one of them, we were quite concerned that he was maybe addicted because he just seemed to be spending all of his time playing video games. Now he's like 35 or 36. He still likes to play video games, as you point out. For a long time, the desired Christmas present was a new, faster card to put in his computer so he could be, really successful at the latest video games. And so we had those concerns. I'm happy to report that he's gone on to have a family. He has a very responsible job in a company where he's the supply chain manager with a lot of responsibility and so on. And while he's doing that job and raising his small family, he's also going to law school and doing very well there.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And still loves video games. So, we didn't super freak out about him being addicted, but certainly between ourselves, I'd say, well, how concerned do we need to be here? So talk to us about, what is the research and what are your views in terms of the whole addiction area?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, we would say that there probably are some people who overdo video games, who are using them to the point where, they're not getting their homework done, or maybe getting late to work, or having problems with their social lives or something of that sort. The questions that come up are, one, are video games any different from other activities that people can overdo, like sex or food or exercise or religion, or, you can name a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And two, is it really the video games that are causing this, or is there really an underlying mental health problem that kind of is driving things? And these are areas that are still very open, to debate, in the field. It's important to point out that we don't really know how to even define this thing that we're calling video game addiction. So what kind of happened is, 20 or 30 years ago when people first started studying it, they kind of said, well, let's just take the symptoms that work for like heroin addiction and assume that that works for video games as well. So you end up with symptoms like, I use X in order to make myself feel better after a bad day. Well, if X is heroin, that's bad. Probably most of us would agree. But if X is video games, is that more like heroin, or is that like gardening or reading a book or exercise or all the other things that we do in order to feel better after a bad day? Usually you do want to feel better after a bad day, and we would think of it as good to have something to do in order to do that. So we really don't have any kind of clarity on how to define what we mean by video game addiction. And at least for the evidence that we have now, it doesn't look like what we're calling video game addiction is much different from overuse of a lot of other behaviors like sex or eating or exercise or work or things like that. So it's probably true that some small number of people probably do overdo video games. It's probably a fairly small number. We don't know exactly how many, probably pretty small. But it's probably nothing different from eating or work or exercise. And it appears that in most of these cases, there was some kind of pre-existing mental health issue. So it's not like video games did this to people. It's more like people already have some issues going on in their lives, and they are turning to video games kind of as like a self-medication-y kind of thing. They're filling their time with video games that they don't want to spend time doing other kinds of things. If you took away the video games, it would just be something else that they were overdoing rather than the video game. So there's, in some ways, it's a kind of a danger in over-focusing on video games with the idea of let's just take the video games away and everything will go back to normal. That probably won't happen for the majority of these individuals unless you address whatever the underlying mental health issues are for these people.
Yeah, I was interested in some of the research that you cited that a lot of people think, well, if my kid wasn't spending so much time playing video games and was outside playing with other kids and getting exercise, if we could get him off the video games, then he would exercise. And you report research that says, well, that doesn't seem to be the case, that you take away the video games, they don't go out and exercise.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, I think your story of your son, without knowing too many details, is a perfect example of what parents typically think of as addiction, right? So the story sounds like you're saying is your son played too many video games. He wasn't doing the activities you would have rather him, like maybe going outside or things of that sort. But it's not really addiction in the sense of like he was using heroin, right? So like you wouldn't have like asked your wife like, gosh, do you think he's using too much heroin, right? You wouldn't have had that conversation.
Right.
And so I think what ends up happening is the term addiction gets misused with video games often. That certainly we as parents, we might be concerned they're doing it too much, but it's not the same thing. In fact, there's a really large study that just came out of Oxford, cross-cultural, thousands of people, and they examined people who had played video games, and they examined the prevalence rate of video game addiction. And what they found was it was about 1%. And now 1% could be really important if it's something like it has horrific, effects on us. But what was more important is they found these people that would be diagnosed as being addicted using criteria presented in the DSM, that when they looked at their social networks, when they looked at their physical health, when they looked at their psychological health, they were not any different than people who were not addicted to video games. So even appears that label, if we can put it on people as saying this person's addicted, like maybe your son or somebody else, they actually, as far as psychological health, physical health, social health, are not any different than the other average person who we don't label as addicted.
Yeah, it's during a lot of this conversation, I'm thinking about golf and golfers.
Yeah, I mean and imagine the amount of money that you might spend on golf or golfing, right? I mean, it's probably actually a more expensive addiction, if you will, playing a video game or the time spent. But because as society, we might have grown up in a time where being outside and walking around and so forth is more valued, whereas staying inside our house and playing a video game is less valued. We're more likely to say that thing we don't value, even though it might take up as much time, take up as much resources, that is the addiction. That's the bad thing. But golfing, that's great. You're outside. How nice, right?
Yeah.
So,
some people pay a lot of money to get a house that's on the golf course.
Even worse, right?
Yeah. They are really addicted.
Yeah.
But as you say, they tend to be the older, more established people. So, we've been talking about the downsides of video games, but or the purported downsides of video games. But there are possibly upsides of playing video games. And why don't you review some of those for us?
Yeah, sure. So, and it's important to point out that just like sometimes people, can exaggerate the negative side of video games, it's also possible people exaggerate the positive. So video games probably aren't going to make you smarter or prevent grandma's Alzheimer's disease or anything of that sort. So these yeah, I know these are actually things that come out. There again, we probably don't see really dramatic positive effects, with things like intelligence or cognition. There may be some small effects with things like visual spatial cognition. Some of that is still kind of controversial as well. Where you tend to see a lot of positive effects are with things like stress reduction. So for people that enjoy video games, now again, just like with any hobby, it's key that you enjoy what you're doing. But for people that enjoy video games, and this seems to work for violent video games as well as non-violent video games, that it does seem to work as a stress reduction, technique for some of these individuals. So we do hear a lot about, we kind of think, you were referring earlier in the interview at sort of this common sense notion of course, violent video games increase aggression. Well, for a lot of people who are younger and who play games, it's actually for them common sense to think that playing Call of Duty actually calms them down and reduces stress. And there's probably some degree of truth to that. For these individuals who enjoy that kind of activity and enjoy those games, coming home after a bad day at work or school and playing Grand Theft Auto 5 probably does make a lot of them feel better and maybe less stressed and feel calmer when they then go on and act, interact with their families and such. So that's one of the areas we see really some of the most clear positive evidence for positive effects for video games, including violent video games, is in stress reduction. One of the other areas that seems to also work is in the social play. So there's some evidence to suggest that when people play games cooperatively with each other, even if they come from different groups, so there's been some evidence looking at different ethnic groups, for instance, that when people play together socially, they tend to have more positive opinions of each other. So there's some evidence to suggest that video games can be one element where people with different backgrounds can come together and find some kind of common ground and learn to be perhaps less discriminatory or prejudiced toward each other. So there's some, it was kind of intriguing.
There's international gameplay, right? And I was in Stockholm doing a dream workshop and met one of my listeners there who was, I think at the time, in a psychology grad program and all, and a woman and her boyfriend, adults, and they're into World of Warcraft. And I was a little bit shocked, what these people are, they're really active and excited about World of Warcraft. And I don't know too much about.
They're all around you.
Yeah, right. But they can also play internationally, right? And so you might be playing somebody who's in Korea or some other place.
Right.
And do you think cultural understanding is perhaps increased?
It could. I mean, we don't know for sure, how
yeah.
far it goes, right? I mean,
Right.
I think the important thing to remember is what Chris is saying is really there's nothing magic about video games, though. That the idea that they reduce our stress, if you like video games, is the same as if you like gardening, that's going to reduce stress. If you like crocheting, that's going to reduce stress. If you like, doing whatever, that's typically going to reduce stress. And so if you happen to like video games, then yes, that's going to reduce stress too.
Mm-hmm.
And then even with the playing with other people, that's just playing. So we find that playing in general, if we have two children play together and they're from different groups, they tend to like each other more after playing. And so video games, I think on both sides, one thing that Chris and I try to really point out is there's really nothing special about them. It sounds weird since this is our life in this area, but at the end of the day, they're games, and you can play like you can play anything. They can unite people. People can overdo them like they can do anything. But at the end of the day, they're just video games. There's nothing magic about them. There's nothing evil about them. Mm-hmm. They're just video games at the end of the day.
Something that comes to mind is the way that they can increase one's sense of efficacy. That as human beings, I think we strive for mastery. We want to enjoy success and to achieve skills. And as an adult who gave up on video games as soon as my kids began to get so much better than I could ever hope to be. So I don't even go near a video game now because it just feels like, I don't want to experience the failure of it. But on the other hand, what they're experiencing as they climb the different levels is that, they have this feeling of, wow, I'm doing this. I'm a champ. I can learn and I can get better and better. And I can, the competitive thing is a big drive for a lot of people. And I look at the kids who on skateboards and so on, and they're constantly trying to perfect these tricks. You hear that board slamming on the ground, slamming on the ground, slamming on the ground. Yeah. But they just keep at it and keep at it. And so I think, whereas as an older adult, I'm like, I wish he would cut out that racket of slamming that skateboard down on the ground. But they're enjoying a kind of mastery. And I wonder if, and this is very speculative, but I think maybe that would generalize maybe as they grow up into other areas of their lives to have had some experience of, well, I wasn't great in school, but then I can really shred on a skateboard or a video game.
I'm sure it could give them a sense of agency. I'm sure. I mean, it's very similar to like what you're talking about. It's like what Maya Checking the High would have called like flow, right? So they're trying to reach this optimal state. It's weird to talk about video games as self-actualization, but I mean, there is kind of this desire for an optimal state of achieving needs, which video games can do. Again, though, it's doing it virtually. So, again, it's not as a therapist, I don't think having a child play video games is going to, boost their self-esteem 20 points and suddenly they're going to become this rock star. But certainly I think that's our appeal of them, is they allow us to temporarily boost our agency and our feelings of control and things of that sort.
Okay, well, it's probably about time for us to begin to wind down. I wonder if there are any points that you'd like to make that you haven't had a chance to get across.
I think one thing that's just good to point out, just in general, is I think one of the things that drives a sort of misunderstanding about video games is that people have oftentimes a misunderstanding about where kids are today in general. And so people kind of think, or say some people kind of think of kids today as being worse than they ever have been, more delinquent, more sexually immoral, more disrespectful. And of course, people have been saying this for about 2,400 years as far as we're aware of. But it's important to point out that by most, most behavior indices, the current generation of kids and younger adults are actually some of the best behaved on record, at least since the 1960s. So youth violence is actually at a historic low. So it's at its lowest level since, again, about the 1960s. We've seen about an 80% decrease in youth violence over the last 20 or so years. Teen pregnancy rates are at historic lows. Teen use of drugs, alcohol, with the exception of pot. Kids do like their pot. And most of that has gone down in recent years. So there's some upticks. Like the last couple of years have seen like a little bit of an increase in teen suicide, but generally speaking, teen suicides are still lower, much lower than they were 20 years ago. So kids today look pretty good, for the most part compared to compared to my generation and Patrick's generation, where we were the worst. And I don't know why necessarily, but since the 80s and early 90s, kids' behavior has gotten a lot better. And people don't always know that, but I think in part because it's so accessible. You can see people doing bad things on YouTube now, this kind of stuff. So it's like right in your face, and it looks like, teen behavior is worse. It really isn't, and most of that decline in problem behavior, occurred when video games were becoming increasingly popular. That's not to say video games did that, but it just does point out that if video games did have this like horrible, mass effect on people that sometimes we think about, that we shouldn't be seeing the numbers move in the direction that they have been over the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fascinating. Pat, you got any final words for us?
I think Chris summed it up beautifully.
Yeah, okay. Well, Dr. Pat Markey and Dr. Chris Ferguson, I want to thank you both for being my guests today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you for having us.